How do yeast turn sugar into alcohol? And what are the key factors to great fermentation? Let's go find out. Hey everyone, Distiller Greyling here, one of your favorite home and hobby distillers. Today we're going back to basics and we are talking fermentation. Now there's a lot of fermentation types out there. The one that I can think of is your metabolism system. That's where foods get break down into energy and we got byproducts, namely number 1 and number 2. But today we are looking at alcoholic fermentation. Now alcoholic fermentation is a chemical process where sugar molecules are broken down by yeast for energy and the byproduct is ethanol and carbon dioxide. So in a sense, the yeast ferments to obtain energy by turning sugar into alcohol. Now the chemical reaction for the production of ethanol from glucose is one glucose molecule gives you 2 ethanol molecules, that's what we want. 2 carbon dioxide molecules, that's the gas that bubbles out of your bubbler, and heat. Now heat shows that it's an exothermic reaction, but we'll get to this guy a bit later. Fun fact, in a rare medical condition called gut fermentation syndrome or autobrewery syndrome, your body itself starts to ferment and causes ethanol inside the body and you get intoxicated from the inside. How crazy is that? Try to explain that to your boss next time. Now let's look at yeast. Yeast are very hardy microorganisms, but they need certain conditions to thrive in. We are going to look at 5 key points to make a happy home for the yeast to have a great fermentation. The 5 things we're going to look at is sugar, pH, aeration, nutrients, and the yeast itself. First up is sugar. We need sugar for the yeast to convert it into alcohol, and we get it from our raw materials. Raw materials can be plain sugar, molasses, fruits, or grain, or a combination of some of them. Now it doesn't mean that if you ferment grain you're going to get a whiskey. If you use grain as a source of sugar, it has the potential to become a great whiskey. Sugar wash is straightforward. It's basically sugar and water. You follow a very simple recipe, you check your turbo yeast directions, and you're good to go. Molasses is a sticky one. Molasses got a lot of sugar, but not all the sugars are fermentable. So we have to dilute it a bit to prevent your yeast from overstressing due to much sugar. If we do overstress the yeast, we can get unwanted flavors, and that's not probably what we want. Trickle 1 molasses has got more fermentable sugar but lesser flavor. Trickle 3 molasses has got more flavor but fewer fermentable sugars. So to get your yield that you want, you either gotta add more of the trickle 3 or maybe substitute it with plain table sugar. It depends on what your end product is and what your aim is. Fruit can be tricky or super simple. For a commercial distiller, you want consistency. So it's sometimes a bit hard to find fruit that's constant, as there's a lot of factors that can influence it during the growth cycle. But for a home distiller, you don't have to worry too much. You follow a simple recipe that you're familiar with and you change it the next time you do it again if you want to change the flavor or reduce it or give it more, or maybe a combination of fruits if you really want to go that route. For fruit, you just have to be careful for pectin. That's that white bits of the fruit. Think of an orange. When you start to peel it, the inside of the skin is that white stuff. That is pectin. But it can be treated with a pectin enzyme. So be sure that if you have got a lot of pectin in your fermentation, use a bit of pectin enzymes to break down that. The pectin itself will ferment and make more methanol, and we don't want that. That's the part of the foreshorts or heads we want to get rid of. So if you can break it down during fermentation, that is great. Grain is a bit of work, but it's actually very simple. First we need to do a starch conversion to get hold of all those lovely sugars we want. Go check out my video about starch conversion. There I explain everything nicely of how you can perform a starch conversion. Now sugar content for all your raw materials can be checked by using a refractometer or an SG hydrometer. Use one what you're familiar with. Second up we got pH. Now for every raw material there's a kind of a set guidelines. For fruit and molasses you're aiming for a 4.5 to a 5.5 range, and for grains you're looking for a 5.5 to a 6.5 range. But it's always good to look at your yeast and see what is the yeast tolerance or yeast desired range where it wants to thrive in, before you just assume that this will be your set standards. We use an acid like citric acid to lower the pH, and we use an alkaline like potassium carbonate to bring it up again. I use a digital pH meter. It works much simpler, but you can use those small pH strips as well. It just might be sometimes a bit tricky. Third up, we got aeration. Yeast needs oxygen for that first and initial reproduction phase as it starts in your fermentation. If you were boiling your water for your fermentation or heating it up, you got rid of some of those oxygen and you do want to aerate again. Aeration can be done by bubbling air through your fermentation through a air stone or a normal aquarium pump that you use for a fish tank. You can do it by stirring vigorously or use a drill to make sure you got all those nice and air inside and it's bubbling nicely. Or if the volume is small, you can throw it back and forth between two buckets and that sloshing effect will get nice oxygen inside. Or even if it's a small volume, you can shake it up and make sure all those air is back inside. Fourth up is nutrients. They are very important for the survival and growth of your yeast. As a rule of thumb, I use for my fruit and molasses a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that for every 10 grams of yeast, I use 10 grams of nutrients. Grain wash already has got a lot of nutrients inside, but I still want to add some nutrients, so I would go for a 20% nutrients to my yeast, saying that if I got 10 grams of yeast, I'm going to end up with about 2 grams of nutrients. Get the nutrients in there, it will definitely help out. When you do add your nutrients, remember to add it slowly and keep on stirring, as you don't want to make lumps if you add everything at once. That's going to maybe make a whole lumpy mess and we do not want that. Now for our last key point is to add or pitch our yeast. For small fermentations up to 25 liters, I pitch my yeast dry straight out of the packet. For larger fermentations, I like to hydrate it first. It is important to also add it very slowly depending whether you're doing it straight in your fermentation or hydrating it. Add your yeast slowly and stir it to prevent lumps. Also remember to have a temperature difference of no more than 10 degrees Celsius, as you don't want to shock your yeast with having a too cold or too hot fermentation or water. For hydrating my yeast, I just use normal water. The reason for that is I just want the yeast gooey and moist before I add it into the fermentation. You can use part of your wash itself. The sugars in there, the yeast will start to attack that sugars and it will actually start to ferment and grow. And you can have a yeast bomb that can actually start to overflow on your vessel or your container that you had your yeast in. It's still fine, you can still use it, but I'm sometimes a bit busy while I'm busy with my fermentation, that while the yeast is hydrating, I don't want to look at it every 10 minutes and make sure that it's not overflowing, so I just use normal water. Following these 5 key points, you can make a happy home for the yeast for it to live in. But how do you keep it there? Quick shout out, thank you for everybody who's liking the videos, who's commenting and subscribing. I like you guys a lot, you are awesome and you are kind. Now for keeping the yeast happy, I'm going to look at 3 things. I'm going to look at the fermentation vessel, temperature control and the bubbler. First up is your fermentation vessel. It is good practice to leave a 10 to 50% headspace in your fermentation container or vessel. That's for that foaming part. So meaning if I got a 100 liter drum that I use for fermentation, I will not fill it more than 85 to 90 liters to make sure that the headroom is still there. For molasses, tend to use a bit lower level, that 15% headspace, as it can foam a bit more, especially your trickle 3 molasses. Second up, temperature control is very important to keep your yeast happy. Too hot and your yeast will die, too cold and your fermentation can stop entirely. For small fermentations up to 100 liter, it tends more to get cold, so you want to make sure it stays warm. You can use it by insulating it with a blanket, using a heat pad or inside a aquarium heater, or you can even just take the whole fermentation if it's small and put it inside a water bath. Just make sure you check your temperature range on your yeast itself to make sure this is the range where the yeast likes to live in and thrive in. For larger fermentations, because of the volume it has, it's got a lot more chemical reactions. And that exothermic reaction we were talking about that generates heat, we tend to You want to keep your fermentation cool or cooling it down as it goes along. For larger fermentations, you can use a cooling coil inside directly or a cooling jacket around your fermentation vessel. That will work perfectly. Thirdly, you will need a bubbler or an airlock or a one-way valve on top of your fermentation vessel. That CO2 that releases and builds up inside needs to escape, and it works by escaping through that airlock. Now, the airlock is there because you do not want oxygen to get back in. So make sure that there's always a positive pressure inside and the bubbler and the CO2 can escape. If you are fermenting inside a small room, a garage or a shed, make sure there's enough ventilation. As the CO2 escapes out of your vessel, it will fill the room inside, and you don't want to enter your room and then knock yourself out because of the CO2 inside. Now you can monitor your fermentation by checking the sugar content, your pH, your temperature, and even your bubbling rate. For small fermentations, I don't really look at my pH and sugar content. I just focus on the bubbling. If the bubbling stops, I give it another more day, and then I strain it out and start to distill it. For larger fermentations, especially on a commercial level, you do want to check your pH and sugar content. That will give you an idea of how your fermentation is going and if it's maybe stuck and you need to unstuck it. Another way for home distillers also to check if the fermentation is done is by checking the sugar content. On your SG hydrometer scale, we're looking for an SG of 1 or very near 1, even a 0.99 is also good. If it's in that range, you also know all the sugar has been fermented and you are good to go for distillation. Now that is it that I have for today for my back to basics on fermentation. If you guys got any more questions, leave it in the comments below. And as always guys, remember to be awesome, to be kind, and be yourself. Cheers.